Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mohini Misra, and I'm president of Harpeth Hall's Cum Laude Society this year. It is my honor to welcome students, faculty, and relatives of those being recognized today to the annual Cum Laude Assembly. In 1973, Harpeth Hall was granted a charter by the National Cum Laude Society. Since its inception in 1906, the primary purpose of the society has been to recognize scholastic achievement while also working to encourage qualities of excellence, justice, and honor. This assembly today recognizes members of our junior and senior classes who embody those qualities, who have embraced the life of the mind, and who have attained a level of academic excellence. It has earned their membership in the Harpeth Hall Cum Laude chapter. Cum Laude is rooted in Harpeth Hall tradition, but today I want to speak to you about something that is not traditionally included in a celebration of accomplishment: failure. I'm scared of many things, including ladybugs, the number 4, and cracks between floor tiles. The fear of failure has also consistently found a spot on that list. I don't think it would be too much of a leap to assume that that one appears on many of your lists as well. In a culture of constant performance and assessment, fear of failure is prevalent. From tests and exams to performances and competitions, it's always on our minds, especially in middle and high school. Because of this, I often find myself anxiously asking the question, what if? What if the grade I'm about to get on my math test lowers my average? What if the race I'm about to run on the track is nowhere near the time I'm expected to hit? What if I don't get into that college I applied to? Essentially, what if I fail? All of these questions eventually lead me to ask one final question. What if I just didn't? Didn't take the hard math class, didn't run track, didn't apply to that college? Well, I wouldn't have the chance to fail, and frankly, that sounds comfortable. I'll admit to following through with this mindset on some occasions, and I've seen others do so as well. Whether it's through avoiding an upper-level class, not auditioning for a part, or shying away from an intimidating opportunity, it isn't rare to succumb to the fear of failure. I think this is a result of many people viewing failure and success as a two-sided coin. Each time we flip the coin, we both risk failure and give ourselves a shot at success. This polarized perspective eliminates the gray space between the two. In reality, there are times when our results are ambivalent or not significant at all. Yet it's easy to see anything that's not clearly positive as negative, placing all that gray space on the failure side of the coin. As a result, we are more compelled to consider a third option, not flipping that coin at all. Here, we eliminate the chance of failure, which can feel safe, but also lose the chance at success, or any other outcome. In this way, perhaps our fear of failure inhibits us from success more than anything else. At first, I thought it was a little ironic that I'm speaking about failure on a stage when I'm joined by such accomplished people. Those selected to join the Cum Laude Society are chosen for their tendency not to fail, right? But that's my point exactly. Everyone can fail. I asked several of the girls you see on stage for evidence. One told me about getting test grades in the 50s. Another spoke about getting cut from a sports team. Another talked about running for a leadership position and not getting elected. Things like these have happened to them, happened to you, and happened to me. No one is exempt from feeling failure. Yet, as a community and as a society, we still stigmatize it rather than embrace it. The reality is that even after the time when our success is measured by letter grades and numbers, the presence of failure won't evaporate. In fact, it may become even more important as we move on to careers, families, and all the other things life will bring. Accepting the role of failure won't make us invincible to it, but even if we do fail every once in a while, what's the big deal? If you have a bad math test, know it's not the only thing determining your academic capabilities. If you run poorly during a track meet, the beautiful thing is that you can get out there and run it again the next week. And if a college tells you no, take it as an opportunity to prove to yourself that your success doesn't depend on where you are. Failure isn't final, and putting ourselves out there, or to extend my metaphor, feeling comfortable with flipping the coin, is the only thing that really allows us the opportunity to succeed. So today, I'm still scared of ladybugs, the number 4, and cracks between tiles, but I'm willing to reconsider the role of failure in our lives. I hope you are too. Thank you. It is now my pleasure to introduce Olivia Liu, Vice President of the Harpeth Hall Cum Laude Chapter. She will introduce our speaker for today.
Mr. Abraham, Latin teacher beloved by all, is this past year's recipient of the Lulu Hampton Owen Chair for Excellence in Teaching. An avid learner, he attended Chaminade College Preparatory School in St. Louis, a Catholic all-boys school where Latin first sparked his interest. From there, he progressed to the University of Missouri in Columbia and triple majored in anthropology, biology, and classics. After a brief time at the university's law school, he then attended their graduate school, where he earned a master's degree in classical literature with an emphasis on Latin. Mr. Abraham left Missouri to come to Harpeth Hall for the 2004 to 2005 school year and began by teaching for 4 years in the middle school. He then moved back home to St. Louis for the 2008 to 2009 school year, where he taught at the St. Louis Priory School, an all-male Catholic school. After this, he returned to Harpeth Hall. When asked about his love for Latin, Mr. Abraham explained that he is drawn to the parallels between ancient and modern, particularly regarding the universality of the human experience. Mr. Abraham certainly imparts his love of Latin to his students in 7th and 8th grade Latin, as well as AP Latin, although he has taught every level of Latin throughout his time at Harpeth Hall. Mr. Abraham's students most effectively capture his passion for teaching. According to his pupils, Mr. Abraham is attentive to what his students need, patient, and dedicated to instilling confidence in his students. Others describe him as a lifelong learner who is able to teach in a way that is both engaging and informative. Another student stated, "He expects a lot of his students, but he never sees them as just a grade." It is clear that Mr. Abraham instills confidence in his students, both as Latin scholars and as young women. Harpeth Hall is very lucky to have him. And now, our current Owen Chair holder, Mr. Abraham, will share his thoughts.
Thank you, Olivia, for that introduction, and thanks to Ms. Hill and the committee for the Owen Chair. It was an unexpected honor. It feels very humbling. It also feels undeserved. So students, you probably don't know this. Faculty members have no idea they will receive an award on stage during the Faculty Recognition Assembly. Once everyone is in their seats and facing front, and as the theater gets quiet, the family members of the recipients magically appear in the back row. I didn't even realize that until a couple of years ago, when I started crowding into the back of the theater myself with the other folks who come just too late to get a seat. So I was standing in the back row when Dr. Jacobs and Dr. Pethel's families were quietly ushered in. And as I was standing there, I heard some warbling sounds that grew increasingly frustrated. And as the lights were dimmed, finally broke out into a high-pitched, just too loud to be polite question, "Is this a puppet show?" I immediately broke into a sweat, like I am now. I knew that phrase, had heard it many times before and since. It was my son, Brontus. 2 years old then. You see, thanks to story time at the library, my son thinks that any time the lights are dimmed in a room like this with a stage, it's time for a puppet show. Dr. Wilsman was kind enough to usher Brontus out so he wouldn't disrupt things. But from that point on, the gig was up. All I could think of was, not the speech, 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 not the speech. Public speaking is really not my thing. I hate it. It's my worst nightmare. But a year later, here we are. And here I am. If not for my study of Latin, I wouldn't be standing in front of you today. When people out in the world ask me what I do, I tend to say, I'm a teacher, which is usually followed by questions like, where do you teach? Or what do you teach? You know, the polite kind of small talk that people engage in. But when I say I teach Latin, there's always a pause. Just long enough to be awkward. The question that follows is almost always the same, but why? It's a dead language, as if I didn't know. The answer I usually give is in the spirit of small talk. I like the parallels between ancient and modern history. I love word roots. It's fascinating that stuff written 2,000 years ago still survives. Or I just like it. All of those things happen to be true. And they're all part of the answer. True, there are tons of parallels between ancient and modern history. Let me give you one. In fact, it's a story of a speech, a famous failure. But probably not the kind of failure that Mohini was talking about, not the kind that leads to success later on. This thing was a total disaster. So the most famous orator and lawyer in history, Cicero, famous even in his own time, once was defending a very wealthy and very famous and very well-connected client in a very important case, a criminal case, a murder case. A man by the name of Milo had been accused of murdering his political rival, a man by the name of Clodius. It was a huge case. The political forces and politicians backing each of these men were powerful. Everyone in Rome knew who Clodius and Milo were. Everyone picked one or the other. There was really no way to be neutral at that time. It's not unlike today. There are two opposing political factions, and the issues involved were so fundamental that you had to be on one side or the other. There was no splitting the difference or agreeing to disagree, really. Violence broke out in the streets whenever either man spoke at a political rally or public event. And now Clodius was dead, apparently at the hands of Milo. Anyway, in the murder case, after the prosecutor had rested his side, it was Cicero's turn. He had gathered eyewitness accounts, written a lengthy and impassioned plea for justice on behalf of his client. He had brought all of his skills to bear to prepare for the speech. He was the greatest orator of all time. So what happened? Total humiliation. Cicero famously succumbed to the pressure. He choked. He stumbled over his words. He stopped and started throughout. He hemmed and hawed. He checked his notes, a no-no for an orator of the ancient world. And he struggled to deliver the message he had practiced endlessly up till then. Spectators even heckled him at the end. When he started the trial, he was the most feared and respected lawyer in Rome. When it ended, he had an ulcer. Seriously, he was plagued by stomach problems for the rest of his life. Needless to say, his client was not exonerated. Milo was exiled from Rome. And Cicero never really recovered from the speech. He never took on a high-profile defense case again. Cicero's secretary, in fact, a man by the name of Tiro, later had to publish the speech so that people could read the well-reasoned arguments that Cicero failed to make publicly. If Cicero had succeeded in his speech, we might never have known as much as we do about the case. His failure was our gain. The case is oddly relevant to today's politics for other reasons. Let me explain. Cicero's client, Milo, was a man from a humble background. His family did not possess great wealth or engage in politics or have a famous name. In fact, his father didn't even name him Milo. His real name was Titus Annius Papianus. But Milo was also very ambitious. He had developed political aspirations as a young man. He wanted to eventually run for the consulship, the highest office in the government. But he didn't come from the right social class. And so he married into that class, the upper class, the wealthy class called the patricians. He paid for an expensive education in oratory and law, and he chose Milo as his nickname. He legally changed his name to that. Milo was the name of a famous Greek athlete from history and gave him instant name recognition and appealed to the patrician class he wanted to represent in government. He remade himself when he renamed himself. Clodius, on the other hand, was born rich. He spent a wild youth living it up and partying, and he was a pretty boy. And don't take my word for it, his nickname was Pulcher, which in Latin means pretty. Like Milo, he got interested in politics, and like Milo, he wasn't born with the name he's famous for. Clodius was born Publius Claudius Pulcher. Unlike Milo, he became interested in issues surrounding the poor, which was odd for someone who grew up rich. But if he wanted to represent the poor, he couldn't use the name Claudius, which was a name that belonged to the patrician class. He'd never get elected that way. He wanted a position called a tribuneship, and that was only open to someone from the lower class, the plebeians. It was the highest position a plebeian could win, and it was a powerful one. So he changed his name from Claudius to Clodius, a small change with a big consequence. because Clodius was only associated with the lower class. He even paid a plebeian citizen to adopt him, so it was all official. He, like Milo, remade himself when he renamed himself. So the relevance to today's politics, you ask? Consider the U.S. Senate race in Texas this past November. There were two candidates. One of the candidates was born the son of an immigrant. His family was not poor, but they weren't rich either. From an early age, he had political aspirations and joined a group in high school devoted to the study of economics and policy. He was successful enough academically to get into an Ivy League school, where he actually studied public policy. While there, he also honed his public speaking skills on the debate team. He attended an Ivy League law school as well, and began a career that ultimately led to him winning a Senate seat to represent the state of Texas. Oh, and by the way, he didn't go by his given name. He preferred a nickname that made him more appealing to the people that he wanted to represent. Born Rafael Cruz, he goes by the name Ted. The other candidate came from a privileged background, a politically well-connected family. He graduated from an all-male boarding school, played in a punk rock band, attended a fancy college, earned a degree in English literature. Then he spent a lot of time trying to find himself until he settled on politics. But politics on the lowest level. He served on the local city council and was eventually elected to the House of Representatives, or the People's House, or the lower chamber. Oh, and by the way, he doesn't go with the name he was born with either. He goes by a nickname that appeals to the people he wants to represent. Born Robert Francis O'Rourke, he goes by the name Beto, a Spanish nickname for Roberto. And this guy is kind of like a pretty boy like Clodius. After making the cover of Vanity Fair, which included a glamorous photo shoot, he decided to run for president after narrowly losing that Senate race to the incumbent, who was, you guessed it, Ted Cruz. Only in America do you have the son of a Cuban Spanish-speaking immigrant wanting to go by one of the most generic of white-sounding nicknames. I mean, it's not like you can't tell the background of someone with the last name of Cruz. And by the same token, there aren't a lot of Hispanic dudes with the last name of O'Rourke. I would be remiss as a Latin teacher if I didn't mention the parallel between the politics of Rome and the politics of our own country. After all, the founders of our country modeled our government on the Roman Republic, the government of Cicero's time. It was an interesting but perhaps predictable choice. They were, after all, products of the Enlightenment, which built upon the Renaissance, which in itself was a recasting of ideas from the classical world. Our founders had just thrown off the bonds of a king, just like the Romans did when they established the first republic in history. So the Romans were a logical choice to emulate. And there are traces of the Romans everywhere in our society, even on our money. We have Latin phrases, annuit coitis, meaning God has approved of our beginnings, and a pluribus unum, meaning out of many, one, and novus ordo seclorum, a new order of ages. All written by my favorite Roman poet, Publius Virgilius Maro, or Virgil as we know him today. So sure, that's part of the reason I teach Latin, but that's not the whole reason. I teach and study Latin today because, and it sounds strange to say, and it even looks weird on the page, because it haunts me. Teaching a dead language in some small way brings it back to life. And for me, it also brings back to life the memory of several friends, several absent friends, whom I will never see again. Since I have the podium, I want to pay homage to a few folks who greatly affected my life and who themselves have passed on to, I hope, the Elysian Fields, a place where they will spend the afterlife amongst heroes. They certainly deserve to. The first is my best friend from college, a young man by the name of Charles Linenbringer. We met at the University of Missouri in a Latin class. I think it was 1995, 1996. The fog of age is getting to me. I was pretty good at Latin back then for an undergraduate. Charles was a terrible Latin student. We bonded over this in class, in fact, and I ended up coaching him in Latin for the next 3 years as he completed his classics degree. He came by the medical school where I worked on the weekends at the circulation desk. Every Friday night he would come by. Who chooses to go to the library on any given Friday night at any given college? No one. Of course, that's why I liked working there. But Charles came by with his Latin questions or just to chat, keep me company. Charles was the kind of person who could get along with just about anyone. He was quick-witted, very funny. Here's my favorite story about him. There was a sign by the columns, these beautiful, gigantic columns, not attached to any building, on the main quad of the Mizzou campus. And this sign said, "Respect the ground, walk around," to keep people from walking on the grass. One day when Charles was late to class, he cut across the quad, violating the rule, while one of those college tours was going on. Seniors, you've been going on these tours. The tour leader, just a college kid himself, like one of our student ambassadors, really, had the temerity to call Charles out. He pointed to the sign and shouted, "Respect the ground, walk around." To which Charles responded, without missing a beat, "I'm late to class, kiss my..." Clever. About a year later, Charles was diagnosed with leukemia. Most people would have just dropped out of school, but Charles kept at it. He was highly motivated. You see, there was another thing we also bonded over. We were both majoring in multiple unrelated disciplines. It's not easy to do. We both had a lot on our plates all the time. We were always busy. We both spent summers in school. We both spent evenings going to extra classes. I was working on 3 majors, which I thought was a lot. Charles was majoring in 5 disciplines: English, history, classics, psychology, and journalism. And journalism at the University of Missouri, seniors might know this, Mizzou is one of the top 3 journalism schools in the country. You have to apply to get into it your sophomore year. Typically, they don't accept people who have multiple majors in the journalism school because they want you to spend all your time on journalism. He must have written one hell of an essay. Charles was determined to finish. He was highly motivated. He took time off to do his treatments, but he always came back to class as soon as possible. I was in law school when Charles was in the last year of his life. I was still at the University of Missouri, still spending my weekends at the library. I was miserable, though. I kind of hated law school, and I really hated the fact that my friend was sick. I saw him less and less. I didn't realize just how sick he was. When I did see him, mostly he didn't want to talk about his illness. Who could blame him? He was more concerned about me. He was that kind of friend. One day, as I was complaining about law school, he just said to me, "If you don't like this life, change it, because you're not going to get another one, and neither am I." I dropped out of law school soon after that, and I applied for a spot in graduate studies and classics, because he was right. The university awarded Charles his 5 degrees posthumously, and his parents led the procession at graduation. The second person I want to honor is also from the University of Missouri. One of my professors, a woman by the name of Shilpa Raval. Dr. Raval, as I knew her, was a rising star in the field of classics. She was a cutting-edge literary critic in ancient literature and was poised to be a leading feminist voice in the discipline. She also happened to teach courses in Latin poetry. I learned much from her instruction. But I learned more from her example. You see, she remains to this day the only person of color who has ever taught me Latin. She was also, like me, of South Asian descent. She was also one of the few women who had ever taught me Latin. Classics is a field dominated by white men. So until I met her, I never really considered a career in classics. When I dropped out of law school, she was one of the first people I talked to about entering classics as a possible profession. And boy, was she ever candid about what it's like to be a minority, often the only minority, in a room full of people who will, unintentionally, scrutinize everything you say or do just because you're different. There wasn't a name for it back then, that feeling you get when you feel scrutinized like that. And when you come to scrutinize yourself like that, these days we call it imposter syndrome. It makes you feel like you don't belong in the room because no one else in the room looks like you. You start to feel like a fraud. You're terrified of making a mistake, being exposed. You begin to doubt your accomplishments and yourself. And honestly, it's something that happens a lot more to minorities and women. And it's really, really hard to overcome. I still struggle with it. Honestly, I will always struggle with it. Dr. Raval admitted to me once that she had lapses in her confidence sometimes. And she was a Yale PhD on the leading edge of her field. A few years after I graduated with my master's degree in classics, Dr. Raval was forced to leave the profession when she was diagnosed with an inoperable brain tumor. She was only 34 years old when she died. If she were alive today, I would have invited her to this speech. The last two people I want to talk about are both Harpeth Hall alums. Both sat in this theater not that long ago. Margaret Lowe, class of 2012, was my student for a total of 5 years. I taught her in the middle school, and in her sophomore year, her junior year, and her senior year. I was her advisor a couple of times, and I wrote one of her college recommendations. She was full of life, and she represented so many of the great things we teachers love about this place. She was an intellectual, she loved learning, she was an athlete, she was loved by her peers, she was a good friend, she was kind. She was also the kind of student who took to Latin like a duck to water. There was just something intrinsic about the nature of the language that she was drawn to. And her understanding of it was so intuitive, she couldn't even really explain it to you. She created her own system of shorthand notation to copiously document the grammar of every passage because it was just too easy to translate something. She wanted to prove that she knew that she was talking. She wanted to prove that she knew what she was talking about, and that her work hadn't been cribbed or excessively aided by a published translation. She went to major in classics and pre-med studies at the University of Virginia, where a few years later, she unexpectedly passed away. Her death was a terrible shock to this community. Those of us here who knew her and taught her, well, there just aren't words to describe that kind of loss. She was only 21. Finally, I want to honor Joyce Ward. She was an alum and a Latin teacher in the upper school when I began teaching here in the middle school in 2004. She was my first mentor here. Her career at Harpeth Hall spanned nearly 40 years. It is impossible to overstate her contributions to this school. I can't really do justice to all of her accomplishments and accolades. I learned something important from her. I learned from her what the end of a teaching career can look like. Joyce battled cancer for a long time, but she stayed in the classroom longer than anyone thought humanly possible. She did what she loved for as long as she could. Who could fault her for that? Who wouldn't do the same? After doing a little research for this speech, I found out that Joyce was the very first winner of the Owen Chair back in 1994. No doubt her speech was uplifting and elegant. That's who she was. The first Owen Chair thought the teaching of Latin was important enough to dedicate her life to it. The current Owen Chair feels the same. So, to sum up, I teach and study Latin because Charles was my friend, because Shilpa was my teacher, because Margaret was my student, because Joyce was my mentor. Latin is the tie that binds me to the memories of these people whom I knew and loved in the past. I teach and study Latin because they no longer can. Because holding on to the past has value, even if it's painful. Who will know Charles's humor, or Shilpa's wisdom, or Margaret's brilliance, or Joyce's dedication, if I don't remember it? They lived, they were here, they were important, at least to me. And so is Latin.
Thank you, Mr. Abraham. That was great. Now will the candidates please rise while I read the charge. The distinguished record you have achieved at Harpeth Hall has won for you membership in the Cum Laude Society. This society is a fellowship of scholars whose purpose is to recognize excellence in academic work. As you pursue your education, it is our hope that you will accept the honor of membership in this society as a responsibility to make some contribution to the ongoing search for greater understanding of ourselves and of society. In testimony of your admission to the Cum Laude Society, by the authority of the society duly granted, I now present you these certificates of membership. Will you please come forward as Ms. Jess Hill, head of school, introduces you, and Dr. Art Eckerd, faculty advisor, presents your certificate.
For our junior inductees, Margaret Claire Buter. Catherine Rose Dovan. Ansley Rain Hanrahan. Hannah Mackenzie Higgins. Melissa Langley King. Ingram Pennebaker Link. Alexandra Eleanor Massey. Sarah Elizabeth Parks. Meghna Chandani Ramaya. Benjamin Curtis Fullwider. Our senior inductees, Alexandria Clarice Anderson. Emily Clay Beach. Mia Cosette Breakbill. Claiborne Park Fowler. Helen Adair Griffith. Caroline Miller Kirkland. Margaret Ella Nelson. Olivia Margot Olafson. Anna Scout Robbins. Charlotte Michael Taylor. And now, will the audience please rise and join me in recognizing the new members of the Harpeth Hall Cum Laude Society. Now, will you please remain standing and join me in singing the Alma Mater. this concludes our assembly. Thank you so much to our parents and guests who joined us today. You all will have your pictures taken on the steps, and seniors, you are dismissed.